Hi, I'm Rhiannon from the Epsom Bakehouse, and today we'll be talking about 7 quick and simple ways that you can get a really great crispy crust on your bread. If you'd like to see more of these bread making tips and hear more about recipes, bread making tips, and my online bread making classes, then you can sign up for my regular newsletter via the link below this video. So we've probably all wanted to make fresh, crusty bread and that delicious crack as you tear open a baguette, or that sound as you cut through your loaf. But how can you make sure you get that crispy crust on your bread if that's what you're trying to achieve, and instead of making it tough and thick? Well, today I'll be going through 7 quick and simple ways that you can do that when you're making bread in your own home kitchen. You might think that getting a great crispy crust on your bread is all about the baking once it's gone in the oven. But my first tip starts well before you get anything in the oven, and it's actually to do with how you shape your dough. So I've got a very small sample of dough here. You can just imagine if we to put that straight in the oven, you can probably see that it's kind of flat, wrinkled, and there's not much shape to it. And actually what we're looking to do when we shape is to get the gluten inside of your dough stretched. Gluten is like an elastic band. We want it stretched outside of the dough, and that's going to form a skin, and that will actually contain the gas in your dough, and that skin will actually help form a crust. If you weren't to do that shaping, then you will find that your bread dough first of all won't rise very well, but also you won't have that even smooth skin around the outside to help form a crust. So when you're shaping your dough, really stretch it out, bring some tension into it, roll it up, and you should get a nice smooth top on your dough, whatever shape you're making. And that smooth top is going to help transform into the crust of your finished loaf, whatever shape you're making. But it starts in the shaping. Tip 2, it's all about the temperature of your oven. It needs to be really hot. Most breads are baked at around 220 degrees centigrade, except for those that are enriched with lots of butter, fats and eggs. They do bake at a lower temperature. But you need that hot temperature because when your crust is forming, what's happening is the proteins and sugars that are formed in your dough are caramelizing and reacting together to form that crust. And the sugars caramelize to give that beautiful golden brown color on the outside of your crust. But that can only happen at hot temperatures. So you need to have your oven really hot, and in fact you could warm your oven up to as hot as it can go and then turn it back down to 220 degrees or whatever the recipe says once your bread is in the oven. That crust formation is going to start right at the beginning of the bake. So have it really nice and hot when your dough goes into the oven. I've got a couple of samples here of rolls I've baked. Identical dough, I've made it all from the same dough, same rising, and the only difference has been the temperature at this is baked at. So you can see here at 220, we've got this beautiful all over golden brown colour. It's a really delicious loaf, and we've got that nice taut golden brown colour all over on that roll. Compare that with when I did it at 180. It is much paler, and this is much squishier. Now, I appreciate you can't feel that, but let me tell you, it just feels much less like you've got a crispy crust on there. This is much harder. You can see I can kind of tap it, whereas this one is kind of squishing in. We've not got that beautiful crispy crust. So first thing up is temperature. So you know, a nice hot oven, 220 degrees centigrade for most yeasted bread, so just plain flour, salt, water, yeast, or sourdough starter if that's what you're using, and a nice hot temperature, and make sure you get that beautiful golden brown colour on your final bake. Tip 3 is to do with steam and adding some water in when you bake. You might think, water, that is not going to make my crust crispy. It's going to make it more flexible and damp, and it's not going to crisp up. Surely you want to put that in if you want softer loaf. Well, that could possibly be true. This is less about your crust and more about making sure you get a great rise on your loaf before the crust forms. When you put your dough into the oven, it's full of gas and it's risen and puffed out, and that gas is going to expand in the oven. But as I mentioned, the crust also starts forming as soon as you put the dough into that really high temperature oven. One way to help is to put some steam into the oven as you load the dough in. In a home oven, it is a little bit difficult. You don't have a sealed oven into which you can inject steam. Most people don't anyway. But what you can do is put an old baking tray at the bottom of the oven. Once all your bread is loaded into the oven, then you can really carefully pour a cup of water into that preheated baking tray at the bottom of your oven, creating steam. Just be really careful and shut the door before it steams into your face. That steam will condense on the top of your uncooked dough and keep the top of your dough quite moist and gelatinous whilst that expansion is happening in the oven. So that gives your loaf that time to do that final oven spring, as it's called, that final rise in the oven before the crust starts forming. And you might be able to see the difference. I've got two rolls here, one baked without steam and one baked with. And this one is slightly bigger. It is hard to see, but it has expanded more. And it's quite a minimal difference, obviously, on a small roll like this. But if that expansion occurred all over on a loaf that you would use, particularly one that you had scored the top of, it would open up much more and have a much better crust, especially if you'd score, because that will help create crust. Tip 4 is to do with adding something into your oven to help your bread bake. And that thing is a pizza stone. As mentioned, a hot temperature and steam can really help you get that great crust on your bread. But wherever your oven is being heated from, the heat is coming from over here somewhere, like an element or a gas flame. If you've got a pizza stone that you can use at the high temperatures for bread baking, then put that in to preheat, say 30 to 60 minutes before you bake your bread. And then you'll be putting your dough, say, in the tin or on a baking tray directly onto that preheated pizza stone. And that will help form an all-round crust, and it will also help form the oven spring. So that direct contact heat will really help the dough do its final rise in the oven, and do it quickly before that crust starts to form. A second thing that you can add into your oven when you're baking dough and to help form that crust and get a great rise on your loaf is to use a cloche or Dutch oven. And that just basically moves all those elements that help your crust form closer to your dough. So direct heat, if you preheat the cloche or you let it heat up in the oven as the bread bakes, that heat is radiant, but it's much closer to the dough, whereas your element is over here somewhere. If you've got something directly around your dough that's hot, it will be much closer, and again, it will help that dough rise and that crust form. Also, as your dough bakes, it will release water in the form of steam, and that will be trapped in a Dutch oven or cloche because it's enclosed, it's got a lid, and that steam will stay really close to the dough and help that oven spring, but also it will help the crust form later on. At the end of that baking time, you just need to release the dome or the lid to let the steam out for the last 10 to 15 minutes to finally get that crisp crust. Now you might be thinking, I don't want to buy any more equipment, I don't have those things at home. Well, if you don't, you could improvise with a deep roasting dish. So I used one this size for these rolls, and I just popped it over the top onto the baking tray like that, put a bit of water underneath so that would create steam inside once it was in the oven, and then baked it with that on the top and took it off for the last few minutes of baking time. And you might be able to see the difference here. I've got one here made without steam, and I've got one here made with the cloche that I improvised with the tin. And you can see this one is wider, it's bigger, it's risen more, and this one has quite a dull, uncracked crust. It's quite dull, a little bit tough maybe. This one has got lots of beautiful cracks on top, and it also has a thin sheen over the crust, so it's created a really beautiful, delicate crust there. Tip 5 is to do with when your loaf is out of the oven. You might want to tear into it, it smells so delicious, but please hold back and allow your loaf to cool as much as possible before you tear into it and that crack open that crispy crust. You've done all the hard work at this moment, but when your loaf comes out of the oven, all the water that you needed into it is currently like steam inside your loaf. And actually what is happening, it's going to start escaping out of your loaf as it cools. So place it on a cooling rack if you have one to allow the air to circulate freely around it and allow that steam to escape. And also have a little listen as your loaf comes out of the oven, because you will find that it sings to you as that steam escapes, all these little crackly noises. So let your loaf cool, don't wrap it up whilst it's cooling. You might want to put a wider cover over it, but try not to wrap your loaf or leave it in the tin or anything like that when it's cooling. Get it out onto a cooling rack and allow that air to circulate and keep that crust as crispy as possible. Tip 6 is to do actually with the flour that you use. So this goes right back to the start of making your dough before you've even thought about baking it. And you might want to try it out once you've got things like steam and you've used maybe a Dutch oven or fashioned one like I did with the roasting tin. This one might be another one to try. Normally we make bread with a strong white bread flour which has a high protein content, and that protein forms gluten. But what you might find is that using some of that flour substituted for plain flour or all-purpose flour, which has a lower protein content, and what I mean by that is something where it's around 9 to 10 grams of protein per 100 grams. Substitute some of it in, say 25% of the flour, with plain flour. And that lower gluten will lead to a thinner, crispier crust. Tip 7. Final one, it's about putting stuff on top of your loaf or your dough before you bake it. Don't actually need to have any topping, but I did try out a couple of different things here to see what difference it made. I've got one with a milk wash, so a bit of a glossier top there, and one dusted with a bit of flour to dry it out. And then the final one is just the one that baked under the cloche with steam. So all of these baked with steam. Between the cloche and the milk one, you've got a actually slightly glossier top with using the kind of cloche that I fashioned out of the roasting tin. Or milk, you've got a slightly darker because the sugars in the milk have caramelized. The flour obviously gives a topping. It is obviously drier, so that has dried out our dough and has made it slightly harder and perhaps a less delicate crust. So you could then use a few different ways there to alter the crust you have and see which one works for you. Probably the one with steam and the intense heat is going to give you that crispy crust that you might be looking for. So give that a go, but do try the other toppings if you want to. So that was 7 quick and simple ways that you can get a better crispy crust on your bread bakes at home. Do let me know in the comments if any of those have been useful, if you're going to try them out, or let me know how your bakes turn out having used them. And as mentioned at the beginning, if you'd like to hear more bread making tips from me, I'm Rhiannon at the Epsom Bakehouse, then you can sign up for my regular newsletter with tips, recipes and more information about my online bread making classes via the link below this video. It's been great chatting today. I look forward to seeing your bakes and chatting again about bread making very soon.